channel. So what I want to do again is to thank you for finding your way here and to introduce our first panel. And along the way, I mentioned the yamas. And the yamas, ahimsa, satya, steya, brahmacharya, parigraha, satya, ahimsa. In the 1980s, not too many people knew about the Jain or the Jain, doesn't matter, contribution to the language and to the practice of ahimsa. And I had the good fortune of traveling in 1989 to Ladnoon, 4 hours outside of Jaipur, and experiencing immersion in the Jain community. And a few years later, I wrote a book on that topic, but I really made lifelong friends in that community. And among those many friends, I count Manju, who is Dr. Manju Jain, who will be speaking with us today, and one of our senior colleagues, who is Dr. Sogani. And Dr. Sogani at Jaipur University is a specialist truly in the mystical aspects and the applied aspects and the meditative aspects of Jainism. He has given me so much through his wisdom. Dr. Ellen Gough of Emory University, the first speaker on this panel, studied with Dr. Sogani and had the benefit of learning so much of the intricacy of this system. And as we welcome Ellen to the stage, and everyone's full biography is in this lovely book, as Ellen comes down and sets up her project here for us, I want to welcome others that have just come in to ascend. And Pratima, please come in. And we'll put Pratima here.
No problem. Okay, so this is your presentation.
Okay, so this is showing. Can we make it so it doesn't show the other ones?
So when you're done, just press escape. And then
That's right.
yeah.
Okay. Okay, should I jump in?
But make sure to speak directly into the mic. They couldn't hear me.
Well, they couldn't hear you.
No.
Oh, can you hear me? Should I speak like this? You can hear me in the back. You, sir. Nice. Okay, good. Great. Okay, I'll jump in. I want to thank Chris and Niranjan for inviting me to participate in this conference. I want to thank Manju Jain and Amresh Mehta for allowing me to share this segment of the conference with them. I have to be honest, I feel a bit out of place because I'm not a health professional or a scientist. I don't study medicine. I don't study Ayurveda or contemporary healing practices. I consider myself more of a historian, so hopefully we have some people who like history in the house. Perhaps, okay, so I consider myself more of a historian, but perhaps my perspective is valuable at this conference because it's always good to remind ourselves that scientific research is rooted in culture. It's good to remind ourselves that there's a reason why certain questions get asked and others don't. Judith Butler has posited one of my favorite critiques of the way in which the results of lab-based scientific studies on human nature today often are uncritically thought to contain universal truths. So she explains, the relation between culture and nature implies a culture or agency of the social which acts upon a nature, which is itself presupposed as a passive surface outside of the social and yet its necessary counterpart. But she argues this very concept of nature needs to be rethought. for the concept of nature has a history. If scientists who use brain scans to show the inherent differences between genders did not begin with the understanding that the genders are different, Butler suggests, they may find different results. If they instead separated types of human beings by other categories, delineating, for example, between those people who wear red socks and those people who wear yellow socks, they might be able to similarly prove the natural causes for these choices. In the case we'll examine today, after my paper here, Manju Jain and Amresh Mehta will show us how they can scientifically prove that reciting the verses of a Sanskrit poem called the Bhaktamar Stotra, a eulogy to Rishabha, the first of the 24 enlightened founders of Jainism, the Jinas, can cure various ailments, from headaches to cancer. What I'd like to do then is to look at the history of these claims about the nature of humans. I'd like to look at the history of Dr. Jain's claims, asking why this poem and not some other invocation is understood to be worthy of this research. So here's Dr. Jain's book, Jain, A Method of Curing, published in 2011. I believe you can pick it up here at the conference. Okay, so in this book, you'll see when you get it, Dr. Jain documents how each of the 48 verses of this Sanskrit poem, the Bhaktamar Stotra, is associated with a so-called riddhi, or superhuman power, and a mantra, or invocation, which are inscribed, along with the verse of the poem, on diagrams called yantras. While I'm sure we'll hear more about the techniques prescribed, the healing techniques prescribed in this book later on, I'd like to highlight one of the techniques prescribed, the pouring of water over these metal diagrams. In order to heal various ailments, Jain encourages practitioners to perform a ritual ablution or abhishek of the yantras of the poem, and then place the sanctified water on their foreheads, eyes, and neck. The ritual use of each yantra, Jain explains, thus ensures different results. So here we have various results that can come about from worshiping these yantras. So you can improve your memory, you can eradicate headache, you can increase your earnings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. It's not, when we look at the actual yantras, though, of this diagram, it's not immediately obvious, however, why these yantras, these diagrams, ensure these results. So let's look at the yantra, for an example, associated with the first verse of the poem. Here we are. Its worship, according to this book, is supposed to destroy disturbances. So at the center of this diagram, we can see sits the seed syllable Om, surrounded in the blue ring by the seed syllable Hrim, repeated in a circle around the Om. The yellow ring then contains the Riddhi, the superhuman power associated with this verse, which I've written out here. Om Hrim Arham Namo Arihantanam Namo Jananam Om Ram Hrum Ram Ram Asyavsa Apratichakre Pat Vichakraya Jram Jram Swaha. Okay. My pronunciation is pretty bad, but I can translate it. So we have Om Hrim, these two seed syllables. Then we have Arham, which represents the enlightened soul, the Arhat. Then we have praise to the enlightened souls, Jananam. We have a series of seed syllables, Om Ram Hrim. Then we have Asya Usa, the first syllables of the 5 praises of the Jain mantra, the Panchanamaskara, praising the Arhats, the Siddhas, the Acharyas, the Upadhyayas, and the Sadhus. And then we have this strange, I would say strange because it's confusing, Apratichakre Pat Vichakraya. It could be translated as, oh, Apratichakra, and then it could be translated as to the unassailable wheel. And then we've got these drum, seed syllables, and then we've got swaha. Okay, so we have that riddhi. Put a pin in that, we'll come back to that a lot. Okay, so and then in the central red square, we have the mantra associated with the verse, a series of seed syllables or bij mantras inscribed, and then the first verse, the verse of the Bhaktamar Stotra, translated here on the screen, fills the yellow square at the perimeter of the diagram. So that's what's going on in this first diagram here, associated with this first verse. And when we look at it, there's no intuitive connection between this arrangement of mantras and the destruction of disturbances. The riddhi, for example, is not even a superhuman power. It's not even a riddhi, but instead includes praises to advanced souls. It calls out to this aprati chakra and invokes this term vichakra. Okay, what does this mean? What's going on here? How did this so-called riddhi become associated with this verse and diagram, and why should its worship destroy disturbances? How did each of these yantras, I could go through with all these yantras, how did each of these yantras in this book, each with a riddhi on them, become associated with these healing powers? I'd like to argue today that the yantras associated with the Bhaktamar Stotra have their roots in the medieval tantricization of Jain mendicant initiation, or diksha. Now, in the last few decades, there's been an increasing amount of literature on the so-called Tantric traditions. And last year, Dominic Goodall and Harnaga Azikson, in a chapter entitled On the Shared Ritual Syntax of the Early Tantric Systems, looked at the text of the Shaiva Mantramarg, Vaishnav Pancharatra, and esoteric and Tantric forms of Buddhism in order to define the ritual components that distinguished a so-called Tantric tradition from a non-Tantric tradition. One defining component of a Tantric tradition they found was a particular type of non-Vedic initiation into the tradition involving the construction of a colored geometric diagram, a mandala, and the transmission of non-Vedic mantras. This initiation, they argued, should be distinguished from monastic initiations, which involved the taking of mendicant vows, most importantly the vow of celibacy. Goodall and Isaacson would thus characterize Jain initiation, Diksha, which involves the taking of the 5 vows, the yamas of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. It involves the taking of the 5 vows of nonviolence, adhering to the truth, not taking what's not given, celibacy, and non-possession. They'd identify that initiation as monastic, not tantric. But as we'll see, Jains in the medieval period inserted the construction of a mandala containing the 48 riddhis of the Bhaktamar Stotra into their existing rites of mendicant initiation, creating a combination of a tantric and monastic initiation unique to Jainism. It appears that this initiation mandala, filled with riddhis, became such a key component of Jain monastic life that the mantras of the mandala filtered out into lay ritual culture as well, eventually becoming associated with the Bhaktamar Stotra and the healing practices of Manju Jain. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. I'm going to run through the whole history of these yantras. Okay, the story of these riddhis associated with the Bhaktamar Stotra really begins in the first few centuries of the Common Era. These riddhis are first found as a Prakrit Mangala, or an auspicious invocation, that opens the 4th and 6th sections of the Digambara canonical text on karma theory, the Shatkanda Agam, which dates the first half of the first millennium. This Mangala, an invocation at the start of a text to ensure readers' unhindered completion of the scripture, begins by honoring the enlightened founders of Jainism, the Jinas. So those of you who have memorized the riddhis associated with the Bhaktamar Stotra, I'm sure some of you, Dr. Jain, you certainly have, will recognize these praises. Okay, so it begins praising the Jinas, and after praising types of Jinas who have obtained clairvoyance or avadi, the Mangala contains 7 different groups of praises honoring in order practitioners who have achieved powers of intellect. I'll just fly through these. It'll just give you an understanding. Powers of bodily transformation, powers of the ability to undertake extreme austerities, powers of healing, powers of physical strength, powers to transform speech or food from ordinary to sweet, and powers to make food and dwellings inexhaustible. It then finishes with praises to the shrines of the Jinas and the final Jina of our time period, Mahavira. In Digambara sources, these superhuman powers are first described in detail in the Triloka Pragnapti, which dates from the 5th to 6th century CE. The Triloka Pragnapti outlines 64 riddhis, the disciples, or Gandhar, of each of the 24 jinas are said to have possessed because they, through austerities, destroyed karma, blocking the innate knowledge, perception, or power of their souls. So they were able to get rid of the karma, blocking the power of their souls, and thus they could manifest these superhuman powers. Because this litany was, in this way, associated with the disciples of the Jinas, it became the perfect invocation to be inscribed on the initiation mandalas for Digambara monks that developed in the medieval period. Now, the earliest descriptions of Jain initiation from the first few centuries CE make no mention of mantras or mandalas, instead emphasizing the ascetic components of the ceremony, such as pulling out one's hair, the adoption of celibacy, and the removal of one's clothes. By the medieval period, however, at least by the time of the 8th century Shvetambara Haribhadra and the 9th century Digambar Janasena, Jains, influenced by the initiation ceremonies of so-called Tantric traditions, such as the Shaiva Mantra Marg, had inserted the worship of a mandala into their mendicant initiation ceremonies, effectively tantricizing their initiations. In these ceremonies of initiation, these mandalas became powerful representations of the tradition to which the practitioner was dedicating himself. For Digambaras, the earliest details about the contents of the mandalas used in these initiations are actually found in image consecration or pratishta manuals, since in these manuals, the consecration of a temple image of a monk or muni appears to be modeled on the initiation of a living monk. Two texts from the 13th century, Nemi Chandra's Pratishta Tilak and Ashadra's Pratishta Sarodhar, and another from approximately the 15th century, Vasubindu's Pratishta Pat, agree that the construction of a temple image of a mendicant requires the construction of a diagram called the Ring of Disciples, or the Gandharvale, in the days leading up to the icon's establishment in the temple. So here's a manuscript of this diagram. This Ring of Disciples diagram is described as a 48-petaled lotus, and in each of these petals sits a Prakrit line praising a practitioner with superhuman powers. Digambaras here have inserted in these petals the 44 line, the 44 Riddhi Mangala we just looked at from the Shatkandagam, plus 4 additional praises. Praise to the self-enlightened Buddhas, praise to the Buddhas, assisted in enlightenment, praise to the enlightened Buddhas, and praise to Mahavira. The redundancy of this 4th additional praise, which essentially repeats the final line of the Riddhi Mangal that was in the Shatkandagam, suggests that these praises were added less for their specific meaning and more so that the number of lines in the Ring of Disciples could be a multiple of 8 that would thus fit the common structure of a mandala with 48 petals. They had to add four more so they could have this concentric mandala. By at least the 13th century, Shvetambars as well had understood these praises to constitute their initiation diagram, the Surya Mantra Patta, that is gifted to monks upon their promotions to the highest rank of mendicancy, Acharya. However, and this will become important later, because Shvetambaras do not understand their diagrams to contain 48 petals, but instead simply place the praises in concentric circles, as seen here, there are varying traditions on the number of riddhis inscribed on these Shvetambara diagrams. And it's not common to have Surya Mantra Pattas with 48 riddhis. To this day, then, Digambars and Shvetambaras both worship these mandalas upon their initiation to monkhood. Each day, these initiants will recite a line of praise to one of the 1,452 disciples of the Jinnas. And with each praise, they will place a coconut on this diagram. So here it makes sense that when Jains constructed their initiation diagrams, they drew upon this earlier idea that the praises are associated with the disciples of the Jinnas. By honoring these disciples at the time of their initiation, Jain initiants connect themselves to the original monks of the tradition and thus legitimate their place in a mendicant lineage that traces itself back to the founders of Jainism. So this makes sense to me. The rings of this diagram are clear to me. What is not clear, however, is what's happening in the center of the diagram. So at the very center of the six-cornered triangle of this diagram sits a Sanskrit praise to the enlightened soul, the Arhat. In the corners of the diagram, in the corners of the triangle then, sits this mantra we saw with that's associated with the first verse of the Bhaktamar Stotra. So if you start at the bottom pointy triangle and focus on the pointy triangles, you can see apratichakre pat, and then you go in the other direction and you say vichakraya swaha. Hopefully some of you followed that. It's the mantra that we saw associated with the first verse. Okay. So, what's going on? What's apratichakre pat vichakraya swaha? What's going on? I asked dozens of Jain monks what these praises mean. They're all initiated using these mandala. They have no idea. For modern Jains, the meaning of these mantras is unknown and not important. But I have a hypothesis about their meaning that may help us understand the yantras of the Bhaktamar Stotra. My hypothesis is that the Arhat, or enlightened one, praised at the center of this diagram, refers to Rishabha, again, the first Tirthankara of our modern age. It would make sense to place the first jina of our age at the focal point of an initiation diagram that attempts to connect monks to the origin of the tradition. Now, I suggest that Rishabha may be understood to be at the center of this diagram because this term Apratichakra then can refer to the Yakshi or protector goddess associated with Rishabha. This protector goddess is often called Chakreshwari, but another term for her is Apratichakra. The mantra is in the vocative, so it could be calling out to her, saying, "O Apratichakra," and asking for her protection. Vichakraya Swaha then, which is in masculine, and thus cannot refer to a goddess, could be translated as pervasive wheel, and could refer to the diagram itself. The mantra thus could be invoking the goddess Apratichakra and paying obeisance to the power of the initiation diagram. Okay, so why have I made this hypothesis and gone into all this detail about initiation diagrams? What does this have to do with the yantras of the Bhaktamar Stotra that Dr. Jain today encourages patients to use in treatments? I want to answer these questions quickly in the final section of my paper on the history of the Bhaktamar Stotra. So the Bhaktamar Stotra, which can be translated as the devoted gods hymn, is, as I noted, dedicated to this first jina, Rishabha, and it's one of the most popular hymns for followers of both sects of Jainism, Digambara and Shvetambara, lay and mendicant. There's only one small difference between the Bhaktamar Stotras of image-worshipping Shvetambaras and Digambaras, these two main sects of Jainism. The Shvetambara version of the hymn contains 44 verses, while the Digambara version we have seen at the outset of this talk contains 48. The discrepancy between the sects' versions of the hymn comes in the middle of the poem, when the poet describes the pratiharya, or the miraculous phenomenon that appear when a jina achieves enlightenment, or kevalgyan, and gives his first lecture to all the living beings in the universe. While the Shvetambara version lists 4 pratiharya, the Digambara version lists 8. So, okay, there's this slight difference, but all Jains verify the power of the Bhaktamar Stotra. Very little can be said about the history of this poem before the 13th century, however, and it may not have been composed until this time. Both Digambaras and Shvetambaras attribute this poem to a Jain monk named Manatunga, and hagiographies recount how the composition and recitation of the Bhaktamar Stotra allowed this monk to break through the chains placed on him by King Vridobhoja in Avanti in central India. The earliest hagiography of Manatunga, however, was not composed until 1277 CE, and the earliest commentary on the hymn was not composed until 1369. It's not really until this time, until the 14th century, that the Bhaktamar Stotra became, in popular imagination, associated with mantras and various rituals that could affect miraculous results. At the end of the 14th century, a Shvetambara monk named Gunakara composed the most famous commentary on the Bhaktamar Stotra known today. This commentary includes 28 tales of how Jains recited the verses of this poem to overcome various obstacles, from being stuck in a well, to being paralyzed, to being lost in a jungle. In some of these stories, Gunakara outlines a few mantras these practitioners recited, along with the verses of the hymn. In his story related to the 7th verse of the hymn, for example, Gunakara recounts how a yogi becomes infuriated with 2 Jain merchants when they do not worship him, and thus covers their homes in dust, plunging them into darkness. By reciting the 7th verse of the Bhaktamar Stotra, along with the mantra, these merchants are freed from the darkness of this dust. Now here, this mantra that these merchants are said to have recited should be familiar to you. We again have, at this top, I just copied and pasted from the published version of this commentary, this Apratichakre Pat Vichakraya Swaha. And if you see, for those of you who can read Nagari, the editor, Hiralal Kapadia's edition of this text from the 1930s is confused by this term Vichakraya. He wants to put it in the feminine. He wants to make it somehow a goddess or something. But we know, because we know the history of these initiation diagrams, that we know this mantra likely refers to the chakra, the ritual diagram itself used in Digambara mendicant initiations. In this first section of the mantra as well, we can see references to the goddesses Driti, Kirti, Kanti, etc., that are also situated at the center of the ring of disciples initiation diagram. So I've shown here, you can see goddesses are in the rings, in the middle circle, in the middle ring. Okay. So, here, Gunakara here has connected the mantras of an initiation mandala to the Bhaktamar Stotra, likely because of their association with the goddess Chakreshwari. Gunakara knew that the main object of praise of the Bhaktamar Stotra, Rishabha, as a liberated soul, cannot help practitioners in need. His protector goddess, however, Chakreshwari, or Apartichakra, on the other hand, can help us and is pleased when we praise her Jina, Rishabha. By this time, the Ring of Disciples diagram had become associated with Chakreshwari due to her invocation at the center of the diagram, so they became the perfect invocations to use in association with the recitation of the Bhaktamar Stotra in times of trouble. In his stories associated with verses 12 through 19 of the Bhaktamar Stotra, Gunakara has the practitioners in trouble recite these praises to practitioners with superhuman powers, these riddhis, and sure enough, Chakreshwari always swoops in to save the day. Gunakara, however, only includes 21 riddhis in his outline of different mantras associated with this poem, and he doesn't outline any yantras. We don't have any yantras associated with the Bhaktamar Stotra at this point yet in the 14th century. The tradition that Dr. Jain follows of associating one riddhi and one yantra with each verse of the Bhaktamar Stotra does not seem to have developed until the 16th century with the composition of a commentary on the Bhaktamar Stotra by the Digambara Shubchandra, who held the post of the Bhattarak or pontiff of the temple compound in Eder in present-day Gujarat from 1516 to 1556. Shubchandra was one of the most prolific and active Bhattarakas of North India, traveling widely to consecrate new temples and composing multiple manuals on the worship of maṇḍalas that remain popular today. Indeed, he composed the manual that Digambaras follow today in the worship of the Ring of the Disciples. So Shubchandra's commentary on the Bhaktamar Stotra recounts one miraculous story for each verse of the poem, and these stories correspond to those given in Manju Jain's book. In the story associated with the first verse, for example, a Jain thief escapes imprisonment through the recitation of the first two verses. In these stories, Shubchandra also saw the importance of invoking the goddess Chakreshwari for help. So he too incorporated the most famous invocations associated with this goddess, the riddhis of the Ring of Disciples initiation diagram, into his stories, associating one riddhi with each story. Could this be the reason why Digambaras have 48 verses and Shvetambaras have 44? Could Shubchandra have added the 4 extra lines so that the verses of the Bhaktamar Stotra would correspond exactly to the 48 praises of the Ring of Disciples initiation diagram? I'm not sure, but in any case, Shubchandra's prominence propelled these diagrams into the limelight, and several of his disciples composed manuals on the ritual use of these 48 yantras of the Bhaktamar Stotra, ensuring their popularity up to this very day. Thus, when we look back at the first yantra in Dr. Jain's book on the Bhaktamar Stotra's use in healing, we can see the association of the Apartichakre Pat mantra with this verse. We can see that this association of Apartichakre Pat mantra with this verse likely developed because of Jain initiation practices. Other sets of yantras have been associated with the Bhaktamar Stotra. Here, for example, we have a Shvetambara version of the yantra associated with the first verse of the poem, composed in the 18th century by a monk named Haribhadra. Because of the centrality of mendicant initiation in Jainism, however, these yantras, like this one that I've shown, never really gained traction in the tradition, and the yantras connected to the mantras of the initiation mandala, the Ring of Disciple, have reigned supreme. Because of this tantricization of Jain mendicant initiation, then, lay Jains now recite these mantras in an attempt to gain worldly satisfaction. Now, this history does not, of course, necessarily negate the positive effects of worshiping the yantras that we'll hear about in just a minute. But it does raise some questions related to this issue of culture versus nature that I raised at the outset of this talk. If history had been different, if another invocation had been associated with the verse of the Bhaktamar Stotra, would its recitation still be as powerful? Where indeed does the power of the Bhaktamar Stotra come from? Does it come from the phonemes of the words themselves, the faith of the practitioner, a combination of both, or something else? Does the recitation of the first verse of the Bhaktamar Stotra destroy disturbances because the protector goddess of Rishabha, Chakreshwari, comes to our rescue, or for some other reason? So having put these questions out there, I'll now give the floor to Dr. Jain, who will demonstrate the power of the Bhaktamar Stotra today.